Hey guys, welcome back to the First Point podcast in a while. I truly have a desire to teach the Word of God. So this podcast is going to be dedicated to teaching the Bible. And since it's the Easter season, and since we base our faith on the Easter story, I happen to believe that we should know as followers of Christ, the Easter story. Now, in order to help you do that, I have a study guide. If you want to pick one of these up on Sunday morning, we'll have them at Connection, or you can go and just print this from the website. Please make sure you have a study guide or a notepad, whatever you want, a good old trustworthy 5-point pen. I don't care what kind of pen you have, but hey, have your pen and your Bible. Now, I will be moving pretty quickly, but if you have a Bible, you can always push pause and then go and look up the verses for yourself. Now, what I'm going to do is teach the Easter story out of the book of Matthew. But to get all of the Easter story, we'll draw a few references from other books because, remember, each gospel is written for a different purpose. And the book of Matthew is written to the Jews to prove that Jesus was the Messiah. And one of the greatest ways to prove that Jesus was the Messiah was through his death. So, I don't have time to walk us through Matthew 1 through 14, but I want us to pick up in Matthew 15. And in Matthew 15, we see that here's a picture of the Sea of Galilee, Mount Arbel, favorite place on the entire earth. And if you make your way to the right here, over here would have been where the Sermon on the Mount was, and then Capernaum. And over here on the other side, in Matthew 15, we see that Jesus feeds the 4,000, not the 5,000, that will take place over here. And then after he feeds the 4,000, we see that they make their way back over to the city of Capernaum. And in Matthew 16, we really see a shift in the Gospel of Matthew because now at Matthew 16, we begin to head to the cross. And so what I want to do today is I want to talk about Jesus' 5 stops on his way to Jerusalem to the cross. We're going to start in Matthew 16, verse 13. Read this with me. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, the first stop, Caesarea Philippi. And this was 25 miles north of Capernaum where Jesus would have been staying. As you see, there's the Sea of Galilee. If you follow the Jordan River down, okay, here's the Dead Sea and Jerusalem, and this is where Jesus would have been baptized. But 25 miles north of Capernaum, off the Sea of Galilee, is a city called Caesarea Philippi. Been there numerous times. What a great city it is. And here's what the ruins look like as you're pulling into Caesarea Philippi. And this is where Jesus would have taken them. When you walk into the city, there would have been this huge wall, and there would have been these pagan temples leading this one into Hades, the most pagan place on the earth that there was. So Jesus brings them into Caesarea Philippi, would have been standing somewhere down in this area, looking at the mouth of Hades and these pagan temples, and he would have said, Matthew 16, verse 13. Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say that the Son of Man is? And they said, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, others say Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. He said to them, but who do you say that I am? And Simon Peter replied, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. You got to love Jesus' response. And Jesus answered, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. We win. The gates of hell will not prevail. Guys, we win this thing. And he looks at Peter and says, okay, man didn't give you that, Peter. My Father gave that to you. Look at verse 21. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem. From what time? He literally took them to Caesarea Philippi. He points at the most pagan place on the earth and says, we're going to win this thing. He gives them the keys to the kingdom. He gives them what they need to finish the job that he has now started. And from that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things, referring to the cross, from the elders, the chief priests, the scribes, and be killed. And on the third day, be raised. You know the story. Peter takes him to the side and said, no, Jesus, that can never happen. And Jesus told him, get behind me, Satan. Why? Because Peter was thinking his will and not Christ's will. So number one, first stop, Caesarea Philippi. Number two, that takes us to Mount Hermon. That's Matthew 17. Now here's a picture of Mount Hermon. It's the highest place in all of Israel. They actually have a ski resort there. I've been there a few times, not while there was snow, and it's absolutely breathtaking up there. Now here's a map, and the map shows you that he's taken the disciples the 25 miles up to Caesarea Philippi. That's Matthew 16. And then he makes his way up to Mount Hermon. And he has a very specific purpose at Mount Hermon. Read this with me, Matthew 17, verse 1. And after 6 days, they move forward, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John, his brother, and led them up to a high mountain by themselves, Mount Hermon. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. And behold, there appeared to them Moses and Elijah. Very significant in that Moses and Elijah represent the law and the prophets, and then the forerunner of Christ. So they see Moses and Elijah, and they see the glory of God come down, and they're like, should we make a tent? Should we stay here? And no, that's not the point. This will lead us, the glory of God that was just revealed to them, to Acts 2, to Pentecost later. Don't have time to get in that, okay? So we've seen that Jesus takes them towards the end of his 33 years. It's the end of his life from Capernaum to Caesarea Philippi. Then he takes them up on Mount Hermon, where we just see the glory of God come down. Let's keep moving forward. Then he makes his way from Mount Hermon back down to the Sea of Galilee, back to the city of Capernaum. And if you remember, Capernaum is where Jesus stayed at Peter's in-laws' house during his time at the Sea of Galilee. Now, he knows that he's making his way from Capernaum down the Jordan River to Jerusalem to be crucified. But the disciples don't know this yet. It hasn't clicked. Matthew 17 says, as they were gathered in Galilee, the Capernaum area, Jesus said to them, the Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him, and he'll be raised on the third day. And they were greatly distressed. That's the second time he's told them. It's starting to get it. You know what? We've begun to connect the dots. We're headed to Jerusalem, and that's twice he's told us that he's going to die. Well, we've seen that they went from Caesarea Philippi to Mount Hermon. Then they made their way down to Capernaum, and we saw where he just said in Capernaum, I'm going to die. Keep going. And here we see a picture of Capernaum, and this would have been the house, Peter's in-laws, and we know that they've built a building over it. And the first time I ever went, I was upset about it, but it does protect it. Here's the synagogue, and that layer, that black line there, would have been the synagogue in which Christ himself would have taught. And this is the remains of Capernaum. It's just such a great, great place. And while he's there, he teaches. Now, he teaches who's the greatest, temptation to sin, parable of the lost sheep, and then Peter asks about forgiveness. All right. Made his way to Caesarea Philippi, then they went to Mount Hermon, then they went back to Capernaum. He leaves Capernaum, and he begins to make his way back down to the Jordan River. That's Matthew 16, 17, 18. Now we're going to head into Matthew 19. Make our way down to where Jesus would have been baptized in this area. Over here is Mount Nebo. Over here is the city of Jericho. This is where Jesus would have spent the 40 days in the wilderness and then been tempted by Satan. And he's made his way back down. Now remember, Jerusalem's down here. So he's getting closer and closer to Jerusalem. At the Jordan River, he goes back to teaching again. Matthew 19, he teaches about divorce. Remember, the religious elite came up and tried to trick him. And that's where Jesus said, have you not read? In other words, you should know this stuff. I believe we should know this. Have you not read this story? Let the children come to me. They're trying to stop them. No. And then the rich young ruler came and said, what do I need to do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus was very clear. Don't murder, don't commit adultery. He's like, I've done all that. He said, well, then go sell everything you have and come follow me. And he wasn't willing to do that, showing us that Jesus isn't willing to barter. Matthew 20, he just continues to teach. And we see the laborers in the vineyard. And if you get saved when you're 10, 20, or 30, if you fall radically in love with Jesus, it counts. And as Jesus was going up to Jerusalem, he took the 12 disciples aside, and on the way he said to them, guess what he's going to say? We're going to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and scribes, and they will condemn him to death. 3 times since Matthew 16 that we've seen Jesus say, I'm headed to the cross. Keep going. We've made it from Caesarea Philippi to Mount Hermon. Now remember, this is where the gates of hell will not prevail. They saw the glory of God come down on top of Mount Hermon. They went to Capernaum, and he taught, and he told them again, guys, I got to die. And they went to the Jordan River. He taught, and he told them, guys, I'm going to die. It's starting to register. That takes us on to the city of Jerusalem. Now remember, this is big. It's Sunday morning as they make their way into the city of Jerusalem, and this is 1 week before Easter, and we call this Palm Sunday. So we're now heading into Easter week. Remember, they made their way from Capernaum up here to Mount Hermon, Caesarea Philippi, Mount Hermon. They've come down by the Jordan River now. That was Matthew 19 and 20 they taught. And now as we make our way into the city of Jerusalem, it's Matthew 21. And we call this Palm Sunday. And Jesus would have come in over here. This is the city of Jerusalem. This is the temple. This is the Kidron Valley. All of this is called the Mount of Olives. And Jesus would have been in this area somewhere on the top of the Mount of Olives as he begins to make his way down towards the Kidron Valley. Here we go. Palm Sunday starts what we call Easter week. Matthew 21. So we see Easter week start in Matthew 21, and it says, now when they drew near to Jerusalem, they'd just come from the Jordan River, and came to Bethphage to the Mount of Olives, then Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, go into the village in front of you, and immediately you will find a donkey tied and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, you shall say, the Lord needs them, and he will send them at once. You know the story. They bring it back, and Jesus gets on this donkey, this colt. He rides down through the Mount of Olives. People are laying down palm branches and their cloaks, and they're singing Hosanna, and there's so much about the cloak and the palm branches. Don't have time to get into. We'll be talking about that in a few weeks. But midway down, Luke lets us into a part of the story that Matthew doesn't give us because of the purpose of each book. But I want to show you what Luke 19 verse 41 says. And when he drew near and saw the city, remember, Jesus is going down the Mount of Olives, and he can look straight into the city of Jerusalem. These are the temple walls. These are the southern steps where Jesus himself and the disciples would have literally walked right into the temple. He can see all of this. He can see the holy place, which has the Holy of Holies. And they wouldn't even let Jesus in there because they didn't think he was who he said he was, and he knows that is the place that the glory of God resides. And when he drew near and saw the city, he wept over it. Imagine Jesus knowing that he's about to die, and the very ones that he's going to die for do not believe in him. And he said, would that you, even you, Jerusalem, my people, had known on this day the things that make for peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes. For the days will come upon you when your enemies will set up a barricade around you and surround you and hem you in on every side. What's he talking about? He's talking about when Titus comes in 70 AD and completely destroys the city of Jerusalem, completely destroys the temple, the Holy of Holies, everything. He says, and they will tear you down to the ground, and you and your children within you. And they will not leave one stone upon another in you, because you did not know the time of your visitation. They will not leave one stone. It's because when you get into the Holy of Holies, there was so much gold, it would melt when it burnt. They came in and they turned all the stones up and they're getting all the gold out. It is completely, totally decimated. Jesus knows this is going to happen, and it breaks his heart. I want you to look at what Mark 11 says. It adds, after Jesus came down through the Kidron Valley, Mount of Olives, he made his way back into the temple. And he entered Jerusalem and went into the temple. When he had looked around at everything, this was after what he had just said in Luke, and when he looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. Now here's a picture of the temple itself. And this is what it would have looked like in Jesus' day. Again, he just came down the Mount of Olives. People are laying down their cloaks and their palm branches. They're singing, Hosanna, you're the man, you're the man. Then he would have came in through the southern steps, came into the temple, and looked and saw the inner court, the holy place, and the Holy of Holies, knowing exactly what they thought about him. He spends the night in Bethany. Anytime Jesus was in the city of Jerusalem, he spent the night in Bethany, which was 1.5 miles. And that has to do with how far you can walk on the Sabbath. But do you remember who lived in Bethany? That's where Lazarus, Mary, and Martha lived. And so anytime that Jesus was in this area, he would stay with his friends. That takes us through the 5 stops on his way to Jerusalem. Number 1, Caesarea Philippi. Number 2, Mount Hermon. Number 3, back to Capernaum. And he has said 3 times, I'm headed to Jerusalem to die. Matthew 19:20, we're back at the Jordan River. Matthew 21 was the triumphal entry. He stops, Luke 19, and weeps over the city. Mark 11 tells us he went into the temple, and then we know that on that Sunday evening, he went to Bethany and spent the night. Next week, we will pick up with what takes place on Monday and make our way through what happens on the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, until he was crucified. I know this is a lot, and it's a lot fast. You can take your study guides. If you'll go back and look, it shows you the days, and it shows you where to put the verses, and this will help you know the Easter story better. Hope to see you again next week.